Budget brews are perhaps the best way to get into Commander nowadays without straining your wallet. With the rising costs of, well, everything, it can make a hobby like Magic the Gathering feel inaccessible. I wanted to take a crack at the challenge of building a deck within the constraints of a budget, and one of my favorite newer commanders just so happens to work well within that budget limitation. Hamza, Guardian of Arashin, is a 5/5 elephant warrior for 4 mana of any color, a green and a white. It has 2 static abilities. This creature costs 1 generic less for each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it. It also makes your creature spells cost 1 generic less for each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it. I genuinely love this commander for so many reasons. Firstly, its first ability is a means to bypass the cumulative commander tax. Normally, your commander would cost 2 additional mana for each additional time you have to cast it. But because Hamza's first ability makes it cheaper to cast, if you should have enough creatures to eliminate that generic mana part of its casting cost, you could theoretically cast this for only a green and a white mana. Its second ability acts as a very unique form of ramp, heavily dependent on your board state having +1/+1 counters spread around. I also like that this, instead of the normal route, where you invest those counters onto a single creature, we're wanting to spread those counters out to make your entire board state bulky. Considering our friend Hamza is part of the Abzan clan, this is an all-around flavor win. Our deck will focus on getting out creatures and getting +1/+1 counters onto those creatures. This will put us into a combat-centric line to victory, as we will want our biggest creatures to swing at our opponents. We have several cards in the 99 that will enable our creatures to get that damage through, and we also run several cards that will give us added benefit to having those counters out on multiple creatures. Lastly, because of our commander's ability to make our creature spells cheaper to cast, we're able to utilize some cards that are higher on the curve much sooner, and we're able to take advantage of some budget options to some higher priced cards that would otherwise be too clunky for this style of deck. Let's start off with the cards that will get our counters out. Star Pupil is a very basic creature. It comes out with a +1/+1 counter on it, but when it dies, we can shift all of the counters on it onto another creature. This is in a lot of ways a bit of a budget form of something like Arcbound Ravager, as with +1/+1 counters, you oftentimes would lose that investment of counters once the creature they're on dies. This kind of effect will let us help keep the value by giving them to another creature. Experiment 1 is a powerhouse in this deck, getting a +1/+1 counter on it whenever something larger than it comes out. We can also give it a regeneration shield should we need saving it in a pinch. An important thing to note is that for every creature that we cast that comes in with a counter on it, our commander will use it as mana ramp either to cast itself from the command zone or while it's on the battlefield to cast our other creatures. Swarm Shambler comes out carrying a +1/+1 counter, meaning we ramp with it just entering the battlefield. We also have some deterrence on it, as whenever a creature with a +1/+1 counter on it is targeted by an opponent's spell, we can create an insect token. This means more creatures to threaten our opponents with, and lastly, we can pay 1 mana and tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on the Shambler. Wildwood Scourge and the Mikaeus the Lunarch are 2 of my favorite 1-drops in this deck. Because of how our commander works, the more mana reduction that we have in effect means the more free investment into the X value of these 2 spells. This ability can spell trouble, letting these 2 creatures enter play with substantially more counters on them than an opponent expects, and then they each have an additional ability that makes them threatening. The Scourge will get a +1/+1 counter on it whenever we put counters on another creature, so long as that creature isn't a Hydra. This is going to happen quite often, as we only have like 3 Hydras in the deck. This can also trigger multiple times if we are putting counters onto multiple creatures, such as with Mikaeus' ability, who can trade a counter on itself to put a +1/+1 counter onto each other creature we control. We have Arcus Acolyte, who has Outcast, which lets us trade a mana for a +1/+1 counter at sorcery speed. It also gives our creatures who do not have a +1/+1 counter on them Outlast for a single mana. This can be tremendous, especially since we'll be saving a lot of mana using Hamza's mana ramping ability, and much of our deck will then only cost 1 or 2 mana each. Avatar of the Resolute comes into play with a +1/+1 counter on it for each other creature we control with a +1/+1 counter on it, meaning if our game plan goes smoothly, we're going to get 1 gigantic trampler. Conclave Mentor is our budget version of something like Hardened Scales, giving an additional +1/+1 counter whenever we put counters on a creature, and should it die, we're going to gain life equal to its power. This is a nice incentive to put some counters onto this creature, as I guarantee you your opponents will be wanting to remove it very promptly. Gyre Sage has Evolve, which makes it bigger and bigger as we get larger creatures out. We're also able to tap it to add a green mana for each +1/+1 counter on the Gyre Sage, making this a great target to dump counters on. Similar case for the Incubation Druid, who can add 1 mana of any color of a land that we control could produce, and if it has a +1/+1 counter on it, instead we'll be producing 3 mana of that color. It's another great source of colored mana. Luminar Aspirant lets us put a +1/+1 counter onto a creature at the beginning of combat. It's pretty straightforward, but it's pretty effective, and it's a pretty well-costed card. Quirion Beastcaller is a personal favorite of mine in the deck. It gets a +1/+1 counter on it whenever we cast a creature spell. And should it die, we get to distribute its +1/+1 counters to our other creatures. This kind of effect is something I truly want in this deck. We don't have access to the costly cards like the Ozolith or Resourceful Defense, and so the recycling of our +1/+1 counters is something to put great value into when we get access to it. Good Fortune Unicorn, it's a great card engine, giving any creature that enters the battlefield under our control a +1/+1 counter on it, as well as itself. Managorger Hydra, it's a staple threat in this kind of deck. It gets bigger as our players cast spells, and having trample to really threaten life totals. Oran Reef Ooze gives a counter upon it entering the battlefield to whatever creature we control, and when it attacks, we put a +1/+1 counter on each attacking creature that already has a counter on it. This can be a great boon to our attacking forces as it makes the likely large creatures we control even larger. Rishkar's here, giving up to 2 target creatures a +1/+1 counter, and then making any creature with a +1/+1 counter on it a mana dork. This is great value, and once again, it's another example of how explosive our mana production can be. Scurry Oak is a bit of a pet card of mine. It has Evolve, and makes a 1/1 squirrel token whenever a +1/+1 counter is put onto the oak. This can become a controlled infinite combo using something like Ivy Lane Denizen, who will put a +1/+1 counter onto a creature whenever a green creature enters the battlefield. We get the squirrel, we get a counter. The evolve thing happens, we get another squirrel. Lather, rinse, and repeat. And I say controlled because you can actually choose not to make a squirrel, ending the loop. Forgotten Ancient is a never forgotten in this deck, having a very similar effect to the Managorger Hydra, getting a +1/+1 counter on it whenever a player casts a spell, but in addition, at the beginning of your upkeep, you can transfer any number of those counters from it onto your other creatures. High Sentinels of Arashin gets bigger the more creatures you control who have a +1/+1 counter on them, and then you could pay 4 mana to put a +1/+1 counter onto a creature. Iron Scale Hydra is a card that just barely brushed up against the budget limits. It prevents combat damage to itself, and instead, it'll give itself a +1/+1 counter. This is, in a way, a budget form of Vigor who converts any damage our creatures are dealt to +1/+1 counters. Juniper Order Ranger is basically a more expensive to cast version of the Good Fortune Unicorns, putting +1/+1 counters on both creatures and itself upon entering the battlefield. Lastly, Verdurous Gearhulk can give 4 +1/+1 counters to creatures along our board, and it has trample should those 4 counters just end up on itself. Evolutionary Escalation is a funny one, giving 3 +1/+1 counters to a creature we control, and then giving 3 onto a creature an opponent controls. And this is good for politicking, and can be dropped onto a creature that either cannot block, is tapped down, or is a prime target for removal. Together Forever is our Eternal Witness, in a sense. It gives a +1/+1 counter of up to 2 target creatures upon it entering the battlefield, and then we can pay 1 mana for a creature we control with a counter on it to return to our hand this turn when it dies. This is great to use on something like the Quirion Beastcaller, who gives its counters to other creature as it dies. We can just reuse, reduce, recycle it over and over for extra value. Felidar Retreat has a landfall ability that I would almost consider making it a win con for the deck. Whenever a land enters your battlefield, you can either make a 2/2 Cat Beast, or, the more relevant ability, put a +1/+1 counter onto each creature we control, and then all of our creatures gain Vigilance until the end of turn. This can be monumental, giving all of our creatures those all-important +1/+1 counters while simultaneously making them blockers on our off turn. We also run Jiang Yangu, who lets our creatures with counters tap for mana, and can pay 1 loyalty to put a +1/+1 counter onto a creature. Now, we have well over 20 sources of +1/+1 counters. I want to dedicate some slots to cards that are going to utilize those counters, or give boons to creatures with those +1/+1 counters. Keyword abilities are the bread and butter of this section. Trample and other forms of evasion are crucial, as even the largest of creatures that we control can be neutered by a small little chump blocker, unless they have trample. To that end, we have Anok Bondkin, who gives our countered creatures first strike. Dusk Shell Crawler, Pride Malkin, and Tuskguard Captain all grant trample. I think 3 separate instances of the trample effect is enough redundancy. I don't want to flood the field with multiple trample granters, and I think 3 was just the threshold. Abzan Falconer gives flying, which is great evasion because if the opponent has nothing with flying, well, our creatures are now unblockable. Champion of Lambholt gets a counter whenever our creatures enter the battlefield, and then our opponent's creature can't block our creatures if their power is less than the champion's, which pretty easily can make our creatures flat out unblockable. The most impactful card in the entire deck, and what I generally regard as the main win con, is Sigarda's Summons, which turns all of our creatures with +1/+1 counters on them into base power and toughness 4/4 flying angels. Do note that this says their base power and toughness becomes 4/4, so all of those +1/+1 counters on them are still relevant and will make them even larger from there. To round out the main strategy, we also have a package of cards whose main goal is to provide extra value out of those +1/+1 counters on our creatures. Capricopian is actually really funny in this deck, coming in with X +1/+1 counters on it, and remember, Hamza can help pay for that X cost. Now for the fun part. When Capricopian attacks a player, that player can then choose to pay 2 mana, put a +1/+1 counter on our Capricopian, and then redirect that attack to another player. That new attack target player can then do the same thing, and so you can enter this loop where each opponent either pays 2 mana to have the Capricopian go somewhere else, or gets hit in the face with it. The catch is, Capricopian cannot attack us, its controller, so this can be an absolute blast to play. Steelbane Hydra is another X-cost Hydra, but we can pay 3 mana and remove a +1/+1 counter from it to destroy a target artifact or enchantment. This is a nice little utility to have, especially if we might lose the Hydra to removal. We can then ditch all the counters and get some removal before it goes. Deepwood Denizen is nice card draw, which can easily end up costing 1 green mana to just draw a card. It's also a sizable body for 3 mana with Vigilance, so we can keep it untapped to use its ability after we attack with it. Herd Baloth gives us a 4/4 beast token in the same vein as the Scurry Oak, and it too can go infinite using the Ivy Lane Denizen. Iridescent Horn Beetle, sounding like a Pikmin enemy, gives us a 1/1 insect creature token for each +1/+1 counter that we put on creatures this turn. This can give us a bit of width to our board rather than height, giving us our giant attackers and then our small army of little chump blockers to keep at the ready for everything coming at us. Elite Scaleguard was actually the card that inspired this deck. I got this card a very, very long time ago, and did that thing where I didn't read the card's ability and ignored it as just being blah, but this Scaleguard is really good in this deck. So the Bolster 2 is okay, we get our smallest creature to be a little bit bigger, but the real value is in that second ability. Whenever a creature we control with a +1/+1 counter on it attacks, we tap down target creature the defending player controls. This can be a blowout, as it triggers for each attacking creature. We can easily go in for an alpha swing with our board at an opponent, tap down their biggest blockers, if not their whole board, and then simply overrun them. I did want to talk briefly about the card draw in this deck, as there's some includes in here that I really like. Armorcraft Judge gives us a draw for each creature with a +1/+1 counter on it, as does Inspiring Call. The Inspiring Call also gives our creatures indestructible until end of turn, which is great protection in the event of a board wipe. We also have Shamanic Revelation, which not only draws us a card for each creature we control, but should we have a few creatures with power 4 or greater, we will gain 4 life for each of them. Lastly, 2 of my longtime favorite creatures in green, Soul of the Harvest and Primordial Sage, both act in the stead of Beast Whisperer. They draw a card for each creature we cast, and while they each individually will trigger that ability off of different parts of the casting of creature spells, they both do about the same thing. I normally wouldn't run these 2 because of their steep mana value, but because of the sheer level of ramp that this deck can pump out, I think we can get them into play pretty easily. Now, should you find yourself really enjoying this deck and wanting to go further and uptick your budget, there are plenty of upgrades to this deck. The aforementioned Ozolith, Resourceful Defense, Vigor, Beast Whisperer, just to name a few of the more optimized versions of effects that are already present in our budget list. We also have Kathar's Crusade, which was actually in the deck up until the last moment when I was trying to get to the budget. It's an absolute powerhouse in the list, and it's right in line with our strategy. Cards like Heroic Intervention can help protect your board in the event of a board wipe. If the sky is your limit with the budget, the Great Henge, it costs less the more large creatures you have in play, and then whenever a non-token creature enters your battlefield, you put a +1/+1 counter on it and draw a card. It is everything we want to do with this deck on a single card. Yes, please. Esper Sentinel, I'm going to mention here, not just because it's a basic white card draw staple at this point, but because you can put +1/+1 counters on it to increase the cost your opponent has to pay in order to prevent you from drawing cards. Walking Ballista can be easily used as a win con, and we can swap out for some additional combos to make this thing go really crazy with our commander out, something like Temur Sabertooth. Vorinclex Monstrous Raider is a shoo-in for decks countering about counters. Heliod's Suncrown gives us additional sources of +1/+1 counters, and it ties some lifelink into the mix. Avenger of Zendikar is a little bit more go wide than I would have liked, but its landfall ability does help some of those creature tokens get bigger, and it's putting a lot of counters out all at once. Colonian Hydra is a fun option if you want to take the +1/+1 strategy over the top, doubling the number of counters on each creature you control whenever it attacks. Greater Good is card draw when your creatures are on their way out, and no list about +1/+1 counters would truly be complete without mentioning the counter doublers like Doubling Season, Primal Vigor, Branching Evolution. Of course, this is just scratching the surface of what this deck can really do. I had initially put this list together as a method to teach new players how to play Commander. It's an easy to understand strategy that was both fun, powerful, and it's able to scale as the player piloting the deck improved their skill. I think Hamza is the perfect commander to make use of +1/+1 counters, even more so than some standard Golgari commanders that I would normally use for the strategy. He's powerful, he's flavorful, offers everything I could possibly want out of a counters matter commander. I ended up later modifying the list to fit within the constraints of a $50 budget, which is about what you'd be paying for a commander precon these days. At the time of recording, if you were to buy everything in this deck except basic lands, which 99.9% of you have way too many of anyway, you'd be putting out only $44.62 if you were to order everything off of Card Kingdom. This would give you a functional, powerful deck that would help you get into Commander, and it would be fun to play. If you'd like to see the full deck list, including the land base and the cards not mentioned in this video, you can check out the link to Moxfield in the description box below. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know if you'd like to see more budget decks like this. If you'd like to see a budget-less version of this commander, let me know. I really love playing Hamza, and I really want to see how far this deck can go. And as always, I'll catch you all next video.